Hello, everyone. And of course, my apologies for these technical issues that we're having. Welcome, first of all, to the second season of the online colloquium, Pluralizing the Anthropocene, Re-envisioning the Future of the Planet in the 21st Century. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist based in the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I'm also the director of Sci-Tech Asia, an international research network concerned with questions in the environmental humanities. In addition to being the curator of this colloquium, I will be the moderator of tonight's opening session with none other than Philippe DESCOLA, one of the most influential anthropologists of the present, and certainly a pioneer of the field of the anthropology of nature. Bonjour, Philippe. Welcome to Pluralizing the Anthropocene, et merci beaucoup de nous rejoindre ce soir. Before moving to a proper introduction of Philippe's distinguished career, I would like to say a few words about the background of this colloquium. Let me start with a few acknowledgements. Acknowledgements are due. Pluralizing the Anthropocene builds on a creative partnership between several institutions, representing the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. The Research Center for Anthropology and Health, the Fundação de Serralves, the International Research Network Sci-Tech Asia, the Center for Functional Ecology, Science for People and the Planet, and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I would like to thank these institutions for their encouragement and for making this colloquium possible. And many thanks also are due to the members of the Serralves technical team for making miracles like the one that just happened just now with the technical issues with the internet. Serralves is a leading global cultural institution that is well known for its role in promoting public debates on topics that matter to everyone. And there is hardly any topic that matters more to everyone than the increasing environmental and climate uncertainties of the present era. The publication last August of a report written by experts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made newspaper headlines all over the world due to a series of alarming predictions for 2030 that paint a picture of growing environmental and climate disruptions in different parts of the world, including the one that Serralves Foundation is based in Portugal. This 3,000-page report makes it quite clear that while the effects of these disruptions differ from place to place, from social group to social group, what is causing these disruptions are systemic factors that are global in scope and that need to be addressed in the short term to reverse the trend of ruination and avoid compromising the livability of the planet. When I first started talking about this colloquium with colleagues at the University of Coimbra, I wanted to create an open, multivocal and international forum of debate that brought together scholars from different parts of the world and from many different fields across the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. But I wanted to create a forum of debate that remained connected to the larger public. So I invited scholars to explain their vision of what got us into this mess and how we can get out of it in a simple language. The present decade, the third of the 21st century, will be decisive when it comes to addressing the current environmental crisis before we plunge into a conjuncture of chaos, confusion, and rising inequalities much worse than the ones that we are already experiencing in the present. I know there are many people out there that are denying the relevance and the urgency of these concerns, but even these people cannot really ignore debates on environmental destruction, climate change, and the future of human life on the planet. These are the biggest challenges of the epoch we live in, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. The term of Anthropocene was coined by the late atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen in a conference sometime in 2000 to highlight the role of human activities in climate change. The term was then appropriated by geologists to refer to the present geological era as a period in which humans have become one of the most potent geophysical forces in the planet. And their activities, of course, are leading to increasing environmental uncertainties. We are now into 2021, and Paul Crutzen died earlier this year, and there is still no consensus within the geophysical sciences on the validity of the term Anthropocene, just as there is no consensus on the precise beginning of the Anthropocene as a geological era. But most scholars would agree with Crutzen that the environmental impact of the human planetary expansion has become increasingly visible after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In the last 2 decades, the term Anthropocene has gained increasing popularity beyond the geophysical sciences, entering the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, and the media, and leading to the development of critical alternative terms like Capitalocene and many other, all of which defined in relation to the original concept of the Anthropocene. Whichever way we look at this concept, the Anthropocene has entered global cultural and political imaginaries as some kind of hyper-object or magnet that helps capture the tensions and the dilemmas of the age we live in. An age that is marked by increasing anxieties about the future of human life on the planet. But the Anthropocene is not just about a runaway world of environmental doom. It is also about overcoming disaster and catastrophe and creating new visions of hope and justice. The realities of environmental pollution, anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, and sea level rise compel a reimagining of humanity's place in the world and an urgent rethinking of the dominant forces threatening the ecological balance of the planet. A rethinking that must go beyond make-do patchwork interventions like green capitalism and technological solutionism. The colloquium Pluralizing the Anthropocene is an attempt to develop a more inclusive and diverse understanding of the challenges ahead. Using the term Anthropocene to refer to the current age of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties has started new conversations about what needs to be changed in the global economic system. But it has also generated a monolithic understanding of the Anthropocene as a unified human experience. The framing of the Anthropocene around a universalizing species paradigm has a homogenizing effect that hides significant exclusions and inequalities. Not all humans are equally implicated in the major forces driving contemporary human environmental crises, and not all humans and hardly any non-humans are invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. If we really want to do something to create a global economic system that is truly sustainable in the long run, we need to be capable of developing a more inclusive conversation. And we need to be capable of building a global economy that is no longer focused on conquering nature. The second season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will feature scholars in the humanities and social sciences whose work is strongly committed to a diverse and inclusive understanding of the challenges of the Anthropocene. Every talk, as in the previous season, will be followed by an informal conversation and a Q&A session with the audience via the chat function. The chat function is currently closed, but it will be open towards the end of the talk. If you would like to ask a question, please prepare your question and have it ready to be posted in the chat box once the Q&A session starts. This talk will be conducted in English. If you need language assistance, Microsoft Teams has a live transcript function that can be activated by pressing the live transcript symbol that should be located in the right bottom corner of the Microsoft Teams application. Please bear in mind that this event is being recorded by Serhavs and will be later released for public viewing via social media and the internet. If you missed the first season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene, you can watch the videos in the YouTube channel of Serhavs. But let me go back to the main reason we are all here. The second season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will open tonight with a talk by Philippe DESCOLA, and we are truly honored to have him here. His pioneering efforts to integrate anthropological and ecological approaches have inspired many people around the world and will continue to do so for many years to come. Philippe DESCOLA is Emeritus Professor at the Collège de France. He initially specialized in the ethnology of Amazonia, focusing on the relations of native societies with non-humans. Besides his field research with the Ashuar of Ecuador, he has published extensively on the comparative approach of the relations between humans and non-humans. Among his books in English are In the Society of Nature, The Spares of Twilight, Beyond Nature in Culture, and The Ecology of Others. He just published in France a new book that combines his interests in the anthropology of nature with the anthropology of art, which I truly recommend because I think it's going to become a classic. Les formes du visible, une anthropologie de la figuration. He's a foreign member of the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Philippe, I'm truly delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, Philippe DESCOLA, Anthropizing the Earth, Where Did It Go Wrong? Philippe, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? I hear an echo. Am I the only one to hear it? That's better. Can you hear me now?
I think so. It's much better, Philippe.
Very well.
Yeah.
So thank you for inviting me to give this first lecture of the cycle Pluralizing the Anthropocene. And sorry for this delay, which was largely due to incompatibilities between different systems over Europe, which is a sad story after so many years of integration, but well. Humboldt, the great German geographer, inventor of cosmography, used to describe his research as a study of the progressive habitability of the surface of the earth, which he understood as the ways in which humans had gradually transformed their environments to bend them to their needs, creating ecosystems dominated by human influence. And while Humboldt saw the earth as a great interconnected organism, it was also clear that human beings were an active part of this organism, and therefore that the natural history of humanity was inextricably bound up with the human history of nature. Nevertheless, 200 years later, we find ourselves faced with an urgent question. How did we manage to set off a chain of events that will actually make our planet progressively less inhabitable, not more so? And what can we do to turn the tide? What happened between Humboldt's optimistic claim that all natural forces, including human beings, are interconnected, and the increasingly glaring realization that was in his time, that what in his time had not yet been dubbed the Anthropocene, has become both a symptom and a symbol of humanity's catastrophic failures. We can identify at least two developments that led us to this point. First, the anthropization of the earth that Humboldt recognized in his time has reached a tipping point through mechanisms he could not have foreseen. Global warming, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and water, air, and soil pollution. Now we might even regard recent human activity as the dominant form of evolutionary pressure in the biosphere. New products like antibiotics, pesticides, and GMOs, combined with the introduction of exotic species into new habitats, the spread of pathogens with the ability to slip across the species barrier, intensive monoculture, and the selection effects of higher atmospheric and ocean temperatures have, in a way, altered the course of evolution. The second difference between Humboldt's world and the one we live in today is that in the interim, a tiny proportion of humanity has staked its claim to Earth's resources, pillaging the planet to secure its so-called well-being. The actions of this minority make life harder for the many other human and non-human beings forced to pay a daily price for this profligate greed. It is not then humanity in general that has brought about the Anthropocene. It is a particular system. It is a way of life. It is an ideology. It is a way of making sense of the world and of everything in it. And this way of life, this system, continues to seduce an ever-growing number of people. And we must try to understand this way of life, this way of seeing things, if we are to attempt to put it behind us and ward off some of its direct consequences. These two developments, unfolding over the course of centuries, demand a moment of our attention before we go on to envision new ways of thinking that might just lead to new ways of being. What exactly is this new stage in Earth history that we have taken to calling the Anthropocene? How does this concept differ from the idea of a rolling anthropization of the planet, the effects of which can be detected as far back as the start of the Holocene? We know now that even in regions where human activity seemed to have had little impact before European colonization, like the Amazon or like Australia, ecosystems were profoundly changed over the course of the preceding 10,000 years by human management of the environment. Activities like slash and burn, horticulture, agroforestry, and selective brush fires had a particular impact. And yet, amid this slowly advancing wave of anthropization that disrupted ecosystems in many different ways, especially in terms of the density and distribution of plant and animal species, the Anthropocene is defined first and foremost by the climate-related consequences of human action and their feedback effects on conditions for life on Earth. In fact, all available evidence suggests that we are on the brink of a major tipping point in the planet's regulatory systems, the repercussions of which can be roughly predicted at the global level. What we don't yet fully understand is how these repercussions and the upheaval they will inevitably provoke for Earth inhabitant will play out more locally. If social science has a part to play in this new age, both as a framework for analysis and as a grounding for envisaging different futures, It is thanks to its capacity to shift between different temporal and spatial scales, taking in the full spectrum of changes that will, for future generations, if not for our own, change how we live on planet Earth. And these effects will be felt in varying ways in different parts of the world and by different groups of humans and non-humans equally. These variations of scale can be seen, for instance, in the wide range of views on when the Anthropocene began as a geological epoch and therefore how it should be defined. And here I should acknowledge that it took me quite some time to recognize the catastrophic nature of this change in climate conditions and to grasp the fundamental difference between the gradual anthropization of the planet I've been referring to, dating back to well before the start of the Holocene, and what a growing number of Earth scientists are now calling the Anthropocene. Perhaps I could be forgiven for my reticence because over my 40 years as an anthropologist, I have studied, was really basically what I was doing. I was studying the relationships between humans and non-humans in parts of the world where terrestrial ecosystems were largely spared the direct impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And while doing this, I became very well aware that most biotopes have been profoundly altered by human activity. One example that particularly struck me, of course, was how the floral composition of the Amazon rainforest has been completely transformed over the course of the last 10,000 years due to the interventions and cultural practices of the Amerindians. As a result, while levels of biodiversity have remained much the same, those areas in which humans have had an active presence for a long time display a much higher density of plant species useful to humans. So it would be absurd to suppose, as many did at one time, that human populations in this region, in Amazonia, were obliged to adapt socially, culturally, technologically to static ecosystems that remained intact and free of any anthropogenic interference. In short, at no time have I felt the anthroposphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere to be independent of each other. Nonetheless, I eventually came to realize that the ongoing process of anthropization and the Anthropocene proper are two very different phenomena. The first, anthropization, as it goes on and still goes on in many parts of the world, is the outcome of the long story of co-evolution between humans and non-humans that has proceeded uninterrupted for the last 200,000 years, as it reshaped ecosystems and altered their functioning. This process, of course, changed the planet, often in irreversible ways and often with unforeseen regional effects. Just such is the case, for instance, of the impact of deforestation on local climate patterns or of intensive agriculture on soil structure. But the Anthropocene denotes a more global systemic effect. Certainly, changes to local ecosystems are a contributing factor, but the overall result is a cumulative and accelerating transformation of the Earth's climate system, the consequence of which will be felt for many centuries, perhaps millennia. And in this case, it is entirely reasonable to point to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around 1800 as the start of this transition. It is quite plausible that ecosystems change at the regional level, such, for instance, as the sharp decline in forest clearance that ensued from the demographic collapse of Amerindian communities following the arrival of European colonizer, or again, local geophysical events such as the eruption of the Tambora in 1815 or the eruption of the Krakatoa in 1883 may have temporarily disrupted the global climate equilibrium. However, these effects would have been short-lived and relatively weak. So the definition of the Anthropocene as a global systemic transformation that began a little over 200 years ago presents both an advantage and a risk for the social sciences and indeed for the way human communities respond to this transformation in general. Here, I'm not talking about the debate among earth scientists over the existence of a genuine stratotypic point occurring at around 1800, more commonly known as a golden spike, that is an indisputable geological marker indicating the transition between two geological strata. It is important indeed that there is a generally accepted definition of a golden spike, because unless this definition is met, the International Union of Geological Sciences International Commission on Stratigraphy will not recognize the Anthropocene as a true geological epoch. However, this decision is of no real consequence to the questions that we humans must pose with respect to the causes and consequences of environmental change. Much more pressing, in fact, is the need to identify our responsibilities and determine a course of mitigating action. Which groups of humans and non-humans, which organisms, and which kinds of practice and living patterns affect the interaction between the geosphere, the biosphere, and the atmosphere, and how? At what spatial and temporal scales are these effects produced, and how do these scales fit together? And from this perspective, the decision to settle on the end of the 18th century as the start of this new geological epoch is a welcome development, because it allows us to cut through the confusion surrounding the mysterious anthropos behind the Anthropocene. Who is this anthropos? Who is this human that has provoked this new, the emergence of this new geological period? Neither global warming nor the sixth mass extinction is being driven by humanity as a whole. Whatever the effects of the actions of indigenous Amazonian or Australian Aborigines on the ecosystems they helped to transform, they are not to blame for the fact that concentrations of atmospheric CO2 have risen by 1/3 for the acidification of the oceans or for our rapidly melting glaciers. The primary catalyst of the Anthropocene, as I stressed earlier, was the development of a particular mode of worlding, first in Western Europe and subsequently in other parts of the world. And this mode of worlding has been given, of course, various names, as Gonçalo mentioned, depending on the aspects that are being called into question, including industrial capitalism, the thermodynamic revolution, the technocene, modernity, or naturalism. I favor the last term for reasons that I will explain later. What does this form of worlding consist of? It is founded on the claim, unprecedented in all the history of humanity, that there is a substantive difference between humans and non-humans, and not just a difference in degree. It's a difference of nature, not a difference of degree. And the distinction hinges on the claim that while humans share the same universal physical and chemical properties as all other organisms, we are set apart, we humans, as by our moral and cognitive dispositions. The result of this belief is the construction of a hypostasized nature from which human beings remove themselves. And we observe then this nature, we moderns, from a privileged vantage point, all the better to study it and to turn it to our advantage. This is the guiding principle of an ontology, which I called naturalism, which can be traced back, in fact, to just before the explosion in scientific and technological endeavors that it made possible in the final third of the 18th century. And upon this ontological foundation, a fundamentally new relationship with nature and energy was built. For thousands of years, agrarian societies relied on solar energy, that is, on the photosynthesis of many different plant species and their conversion into food. And also they relied on the kinetic energy provided by human and animal toil. So life centered around labor and land, resources that for a long time were inalienable. The emergence of market capitalism and the colonial and then imperial system that supported it meant that sources of energy, of raw material, and of manufactured goods could be diversified, as well as their perequation or their equivalence ensured by money. And thanks to cheap freight transport and differential production costs, there was now a good profit to be made from trade. As Marx observed long ago, not only had money become something that could be created through the transfer of goods, as opposed to being a mere medium of exchange, it also provided the means for obtaining affordable energy without the need for control of agricultural land. And this is when the great illusion of the last 200 years emerged, the idea that nature is an infinite resource, allowing infinite growth based on infinite technological advances. So in this respect, Watt's invention, James Watt's invention, was not so much the catalyst for the Anthropocene as an early product of a trade boom that created the need to control fossil energy sources, which from now on would be of greater importance for production and transportation than the energy stored in living organisms. Let us now move to consider the inherent difficulties of the Anthropocene concept. The first, as I already said, derives from its global nature. If the Anthropocene is not synonymous with anthropization, if this new geological epoch marks the advent of a new science of the interaction between Earth system that requires more than the simple aggregation of our knowledge of ecosystems, geosystems, and anthroposystems, then what are we to do with these branches of knowledge? Or how can we bring these fields together to better understand how feedback loops at different scales link environmental change, climate change, altered biotic communities, and human activity? Ecologists and anthropologists can testify to the huge difficulties awaiting any discipline that sets out to describe and to model the behavior and interactions of a vast number of actors or agents in a vast number of situations, whether the unit of analysis is a local ecosystem or a human community. So the question is, how can we conceive of a science that would be capable of achieving this feat at the planetary scale, accounting for every level of relevance and every effect of interagency? Such a science, such a massive collective intelligence has not yet been developed, and this is undoubtedly one of the most pressing challenges that the Anthropocene presents us with. But also the globality of the Anthropocene forces us to consider what cosmopolitical responses we might formulate in order to address the systemic upheaval threatening the planet. Logically, global phenomena would seem to require a global response, that is, multilateral mechanisms such as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, the COP, in order to dampen their effects. Given the current state of the world, there seems few other ways to proceed, at least in the short term. However, apart from the fact that these kinds of mechanisms tend to marginalize ordinary citizens, most environmental changes happen at a totally different scale and so demand a different unit of analysis and a different scope of action. The devastation of indigenous lands wrought by oil drilling in the Amazon, the pollution of a river basin by a mining company in Nepal, the contamination of marine fauna by radioactive waste in Japan, the water pollution caused by nitrates in Brittany. All of these and countless similar examples are symptoms of a generalized ecocide that is all the more insidious for being the sum of the works of countless agents, all operating in isolation. So it can only be tackled effectively at a local level by the groups of humans and non-humans who are most directly affected by them. For political reasons, both in terms of the politics of knowledge and the politics of action, it seems to me that it is very risky to decouple the systemic fate of Earth from the fate of human and non-human groups that are vulnerable to a greater or lesser degree, depending on their location in space, to climate change and to other forms of ecological distress and environmental plunder. There is no question that climate change is a global phenomenon from the perspective of the scientists who study it, but it takes very different forms for very different human and non-human collectives, depending on where they live and depending on the means at their disposal to ward off some of its effect. In short, while we are all in the same boat, those who are shut in the hold and who will be the first to drown are having a very different experience to those on the first class deck within easy reach of the lifeboats. But there is, however, one thing that we can do collectively that might just change the direction of the journey. It's a long-term enterprise, certainly, but one that must be undertaken before it is too late. And this is to change the engines and to change the navigation system. As researchers, if we can make any sort of contribution, it lies first and foremost in trying to shake up our scientific view of how we inhabit Earth in the hope that our ideas might travel beyond the walls of the laboratory or the pages of scholarly journals. This is why I welcome this initiative, Gonçalo. And from this vantage point, it seems to me that there is a need for a fundamental rethink of three processes that play a central role, both in relationship between humans and in our relationship as a species to the rest of non-humans. These are the ways we adapt to our environments, the way we appropriate our environments, and the way we incorporate our environments into the political sphere. Let's begin with adaptation. For a long time now, I have been quite skeptical of the functionalism inherent in this idea of adaptation, understood as the social response to environmental constraints that are seen as independent from human societies themselves. At the very least, my experience as an anthropologist of nature has taught me two things. First, the range of human behavior said to be adaptive responses to the same environmental constraints is so vast that virtually any institution could be described as adaptive. So it is a Panglossian argument that renders the very notion of human adaptation scientifically almost meaningless. Second, the relationship between environmental conditions and human activity is not dictated by a behavioral model based on stimulus and response, since humans have played a role well before the Neolithic, an active role in bringing about the environmental conditions that affect the terms of their existence. In fact, as is the case for other organisms, human adaptation takes place not only through the classical Darwinian process of the selection of individuals most genetically suited to thrive in a given environment, but also through the creation, the progressive creation of niches, each favoring a particular way of life. Now, As far as the Anthropocene is concerned, the co-evolution of human and non-human organisms is undergoing a double transformation. Global warming, first, is becoming a major environmental constraint to which human societies must adapt. But this time, and this is the great difference, they cannot rely on the same localized techniques that worked so well before. That is a whole array of feedback, micro adjustments that over time allowed this society to transform so many of the planet's ecosystems, creating more conducive habitats for human life. Furthermore, in order to address climate change with the necessary urgency, we need to incorporate and propagate the still novel idea that human beings are not destined to be one of the sides in a more or less hostile confrontation between man and nature, mediated by technology, as the modernist tradition would have us believe. Rather, we must get to grip with the idea that our fate hangs on the billions of actions and feedback effects through which, day in, day out, we reproduce the environmental conditions that allow us to inhabit planet Earth. So a better understanding of these processes, starting with very simple things like the teaching of basic principles of scientific ecology in schools, would heighten our sensitivity to the myriad vital connections that binds us to non-humans, both biotic and abiotic. Let's move now to the notion of appropriation. Roughly speaking, since the beginning of the enclosure movement in England in the Middle Ages, Europe, followed by the rest of the world, has relentlessly sought to transform an ever-growing portion of our environment into goods that could be freely alienated: pastures, arable land, forests, energy sources, water sources, the subsoil, genetic resources, indigenous knowledge and technique, etc., etc. This process was based on a new idea entirely foreign to non-market economies: the idea that things essential to the maintenance of life can be bought and sold, and the assumption that these things should be regarded first and foremost as economic resources destined to be utilized in the production of goods or to become de facto commodities in themselves. There is therefore an urgent need for a return to the primeval meaning and value of the commons, not as a resource to be exploited by all, but as part of a shared habitat for which everyone is responsible. Even more urgent, surely, is the need to expand our definition of the intangible elements that make up this collectively appropriated public realm, to encompass not only the typical material aspects that I mentioned above, but also the climate as a common for humanity, biodiversity, the atmosphere, knowledge, health, linguistic diversity, the maintenance of uncontaminated environments, etc., etc. And this, of course, would require us to rethink our conventional understanding of appropriation as an act whereby an individual or a group assumes a right to use and consume part of a milieu. Instead, we might envisage an arrangement wherein the right holders are ecosystems or systems of interaction between humans and non-humans. In such an arrangement, human beings would be mere usufructuaries, or in some cases, stewards, and appropriation, thus understood, would be the relation of nature towards humans and not the other way round. And this brings us to the final concept in need of an overhaul, which is political representation. It is urgent to imagine a system of representation based not on individual entities, whether human beings, nations, chimpanzees, or multinational corporations, but on ecosystems. That is, on certain types of relationships between organisms in a given local setting, regardless of its scale or characteristics. And this would include river basins, mountain ranges, towns or boroughs, coastlines, ecologically sensitive areas, seas, etc., etc. So a true political ecology, a fully realized cosmopolitics, would go further than acknowledging certain intrinsic rights of nature without giving it any meaningful way to exercise those rights, as, for instance, Ecuador did in its constitution of 2008. Giving rights to nature, which is a philosophical abstraction, has very little consequences. Rather, the thing to do would be to extend to every component of every individual milieu or specific milieu, including humans, the capacity to become a political subject. And such disposition would give real political expression to the idea that it is systems of relations rather than qualities invested in individuals that should form the basis for a new universalism of values. As trustees, humans would not longer be the source of rights legitimizing their own intemperate appropriation of nature. They would be the diverse representatives of multiple natures from which they would become legally inseverable. This idea, which seems far-fetched from the perspective of our current legal and political system, founded on individualism, is not at all bizarre when considered by through the lens of what anthropologists or historians know about such systems. There are plenty of examples in history and ethnology of groups in which the status of human beings is derived not from any universal capacities generic to us as a species, but from their implication in a specific assemblage and indissoluble composite of territories, plants, mountains, animal, places, divinities, and a whole lot of other entities besides, all constantly interacting with one another. So in such systems, nature is not something that human beings can possess, but something that possesses human beings. So my experience as an anthropologist, and it's an experience which now has developed over more than 40 years, leads me to believe that these kinds of proposals are not irremediably utopian. There are other historical contexts in which cosmological and political systems, usage rights, forms of knowledge, and technical practices have come together to make possible such an assemblage as I have just described. But of course, although they are a source of inspiration, these examples cannot be directly transposed, especially given that the Enlightenment, with its promotion of individualism, has left us with the assumption of a set of individual rights that we would be, quite understandably, reluctant to give up. On the other hand, what anthropology can offer is evidence for the possibility of other ways of inhabiting Earth, because some of them, as improbable as they might seem, have already been tested in other places or at other times. So it tells us that the future is not a straightforward and linear continuation of the present, but that it holds rich and unexpected possibilities, possibilities that we must be able to envisage, and urgently, if we are to build a new shared home before our old home collapses under the weight of the reckless devastation for which some of us must shoulder the blame. So here are a few ideas on the pluralization of the Anthropocene. I was invited to propound by Gonçalo. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. That was great. That was really brilliant. I'm gonna, as usual, I'm gonna set off as with a couple of questions. I'm gonna use my privilege as the host and the moderator. I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions as the audience is tinkering and thinking about the questions to ask you. And I would like to ask the audience to please write your question in the chat box. So my first question, Philippe, has to do with anthropization. Okay, I really like the way you started out with Humboldt. I thought that was brilliant. And the way you set out the contrast between what struck me as two different models of anthropization. One that seemed to go to proceed at a very slow pace, like a snail, and whose effects on the environment are visible. It's not as if they are not there. They are certainly there, as in the example that you gave of the Amerindians in Amazonia. You know, the effects on the environment are not significant enough to, for example, lead to a radical reduction of biodiversity levels. And another model of anthropization that you developed that we could call some kind of, you know, far more destructive model of anthropization, and the one that is linked to the debates around the Anthropocene and so on and so forth, and that you traced to the industrial to the Industrial Revolution, right? So you set out a contrast between these two models, and I'd like to push you on, you know, to go back or to come back to this contrast, and to kind of try to clarify a little bit what you're saying. Are you talking about, should we go back to you know, to an earlier, or at least should we take inspiration from earlier forms of anthropization that we know of historically, and also that we know of from disciplines like anthropology, ecology, and so on and so forth? Should we take inspiration from those models to kind of develop some kind of counter-hegemonic model to the one that is currently guiding the global economic system? Is this that you're saying?
No, I wasn't saying that. I was saying that the situation we are facing is an entirely new one, in the sense that humankind, has been used to the slow process of anthropization, although we might not always be aware of it. When I was speaking of this transformation, this modification of the floristic composition of the Amazonian forest, the Amerindians are not aware, at least directly, reflexively, that this long process of transformation of the forest has been going on. It's only recently that people have big anthropologists, ethnobotanists, etc., and archaeologists have begun to become aware of this process. What I mean is that this long process of anthropization allowed for the kind of slow construction of niches, of co-evolution between humans and non-humans that we are observing all over the earth, and that by contrast, the Anthropocene requires an urgent action, which is based on a form of adaptation that has become very different from this slow and system of feedbacks between humans and non-humans, which constitutes, in fact, the history both of the anthropization of the earth and of the transformation of humans as part of the earth also. What I was really pointing at is the fact that Anthropocene is an entirely new challenge for humans, and that the solutions for facing this challenge do not exist as such in the catalog, if you, or repertoire of human actions and feedback actions in the environment. Nevertheless, and this is the second aspect of the argument, dealing with the Anthropocene at a global level, as states, nations, and global institutions have started to do, is not the only response. That is because the effects of the Anthropocene at the local level are very highly variable. It depends on many different aspects, which are in part geophysical, which are in part ecological, or and in part, of course, a product of human activities. And so we have to pursue our reaction to the Anthropocene process, both at a global level, and I think it's inescapable to pursue it at this level, but also at the local level. And the local level is one where the inventivity, the capacity to adapt to new situations is extremely fertile. I can just mention a situation which has been studied by one of my students in northern Alaska with a group of native people there. And she argues that these people who were for a long time, and as still are in a great part, hunters, living out of the game, and thus dependent on the vagaries of the game and of the the itineraries of herds of caribous, etc. These people are in fact probably more flexible in terms of the adaptation to changing conditions than any Westerner who is used to a mode of life where day after day, month after month, the same kind of commodities can be acquired. So it's a more complex argument that I wanted to make.
Okay, I have also another question about cosmopolitics. I appreciated the way that now in your answer you clarified how you imagine or envision that responses to the urgency of the challenges of the Anthropocene will entail, complexity that will require responses at the institutional level involving global institutions, but also at the local level and so on and so forth. But I felt that in your talk, in which you also used several times the notion of cosmopolitics, without going too deep into that notion, I felt that you were kind of highlighting the importance of changing conceptual frameworks. Whichever way or whichever decision we make about how to move about and handle what's going on, we do need to have to make some kind of conceptual change. Why do you think that conceptual change is fundamental and should be something that we should focus on?
Because conceptual change or concepts or the way, the naturalist way of worlding, the one which emerged in Europe a few centuries ago, has in a way contaminated the rest of the world, and the basic concepts on which it is predicated still are governing how we to use environments and deal with other humans. So, and this is a very personal thing in the sense that I think that unescapably, since the social sciences were born in Europe at the last third of the 19th century, and especially anthropology, the concepts that were used were the concepts that had been developed by the philosophy of the Enlightenment in order to describe and conceptualize the historical trajectory of Europe. But these concepts are quite localized in terms of description to begin with, in the sense that they cannot get to grip with institutions and practice that are very different from those that we observed in Europe. So these concepts in the social sciences have to be reformed, but more largely, the institutions that we are now used to, including world institutions, are based on this process also, and three of these intellectual of these concepts, which I think are very deeply ingrained in our institutions and the way we see worlding, I briefly discussed, which is appropriation, adaptation, and representation. And these are, of course, the result of a specific history, but it's a local history that has become a global history or universal history, thanks to the, due to the expansion of Europeans all over the world and colonialism, etc., etc. And I think that these concepts are the backbones of the institutions we are used to. And if we want to change the institutions, we have to think about new ways of conceptualizing processes precisely like appropriation. What I was telling about appropriation is that appropriation is a movement whereby individual and collectives take hold of a part of the commons, let's say, and transform it into a resource. And this way of seeing appropriation goes against the idea, which is common in other places of the world, or at least was very common, that in fact it is the milieu, it is the environment where life unfolds that is the basis and perhaps the founding and the political main agent in the capacity for humans to be what they are. So it would imply a complete reversal of the movement of appropriation. So I think that yes, ideas are important. Ideas because we have to be aware of what are the foundations of our institutions, and secondly, because once we are aware of these conceptual foundations, we can start to change these institutions with new ideas.
So let us assume that we all agree with what you're saying, and that the direction of conceptual change that you are pointing to here in this pluralizing the Anthropocene community is the one to go. How do we move from having sort of this discussion, scholarly discussion, or a discussion with a small community, to actually convincing institutions that truly have power globally to start changing and moving in that direction that you're saying? Is it enough just to sit in our desk as social scientists or as ecologists and write papers or give conferences and that's it? Or shall we start embracing more and more the realities of engaging in environmental activism?
I think of course, it's not enough. It's what we can do also is trying to provide intellectual tools to communities who have already started to experiment new ways of life. And they are all over the place, not only in, that is, native communities in some places of the world who are trying to resist the spoliation and disempowerment to which they are subjected, and rather efficiently. I'm thinking, for instance, of the Chiapas, of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, it's a very interesting experience politically. But I'm thinking also of experiments in Europe, in particular in France. We have, but there are other cases elsewhere in Europe. There are communes, independent communes that have set up called zones to be defended. They usually started as a protest against a major environmental upheaval due to a major project. The one which is best known in France is Notre-Dame-des-Landes, and the project was the construction of a mega airport in Western France, which was to be the size of Roissy or Schiphol or Frankfurt. They managed to stop the project, and at the same time, in the land that was reserved for the creation of the airport, they built an entirely new form of commune, whereby they identify so deeply with humans and non-humans locally, that they've managed to create a sort of non-consumerist, non-capitalist collective, which is, of course, it consists of a few hundred people, but has had an attractive effect on many others in other places elsewhere in Europe. So I'm a great believer in a combination of trying to think in new ways on the one hand, and of being aware of what people are doing in social experiments in many parts of the world, and trying to combine the two, of course, by knowing for the people who are trying to think, because they have the knowledge of other forms of experience. I was saying that anthropology and history are well prepared for that, because what we do is study very different ways of worlding that existed or that still exist in some parts of the world, and use this in order to foster movements which are, in the case of the zone à défendre, are propounding alternative ways of linking oneself to non-humans. There are other forms, of course, but I think it's a possibility that is open to many social scientists. And in fact, there are many social scientists who are deeply engaged in this kind of action.
We're starting to have questions from the audience, Philippe. Some of them have to do with some of the issues that we've been talking about just now. One viewer asks, do you think there is a significant use for global organizations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and agreements like the Paris Agreement? Their current effectiveness is not enough, clearly, but do you think they might as well be abolished, or what kind of change is required to make their efforts more fruitful? And perhaps what I would add, would some kind of social movement, some kind of, in the 90s, there used to be a World Social Forum, especially in South America, was particularly strong to kind of, mobilize people on rethinking or developing a counter-hegemonic model of globalization. Would the World Environment Forum be the way to go? Something that does not necessarily involve governmental or intergovernmental organizations, but involves stakeholders in civil society.
I am struck by the fact that civil society, as you say, has been extremely active in criticizing the lukewarm efforts to do anything against climate change, both at the governmental level and at the intergovernmental level. It's the case all over the world. And one thing which I think is extremely encouraging is to see the young people being very much into that. Of course, they are public figures like Greta Thunberg, but I've met many young people in the past years who are deeply committed to these changes, and these changes are not exclusively a question of ecological policies, no, that is slowing the pace of the pillaging of the resources of the earth and slowing the pace of global warming, but we are really linking absolutely directly a change of mode of life and a mode of relation between humans to the more general ecological concern. So I think, yes, it exists. There are all over the place, young people protesting. In France, the state has been put into trial for its lack of actual progress into fighting global warming. There are very different movements, which I won't enter into. I don't think it's necessary to have a global forum of the same kind of the one that existed. The Rio meeting was one of the highlights of this. But what I think is important is to keep on the level of mobilization everywhere, whether it coalesces into a general global organization. But I don't think it will be very efficient. What is important are local initiatives and relentlessly acting against the powers that be.
Okay, then we have a Capitalocene question from my colleague, I believe, Catarina Casanova, who is asking you, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. It was a privilege for us to hear you. The way Western society deals with others, humans and non-humans, is also a product of capitalism. Can we invert the ecocide without eradicating the hegemonic political and economic system of the planet? Thank you very much.
Personally, I don't think so, that we can. I think that capitalism is the late expression of what I call naturalism. And it's perhaps a historical consequence of naturalism. That is, of the idea that non-humans are mere resources, as are some humans, and that they can be both exploited in relentless ways. So I think it's part of a general struggle, both against to prevent global warming and to prevent this massive. In fact, I think I quoted Marx with this idea that money is, with capitalism, is not simply a mere medium of exchange, but is the purpose of exchange. That is to make by a difference in the price that you buy something and the price that you sell something, the whole purpose of the market economy and thus capitalism. This is very bizarre for people like us, anthropologists, who have been studying and living in non-market economies, where precisely there is no price. Value is granted to certain things, but there's no price to things. So you do not value things by their equivalent in money. And it's very difficult to find that. It's very difficult to invent a system which is not, which has not many of the shortcomings of capitalism. Communism has tried to do that unsuccessfully, I must say, and in fact, conspiring in a way with capitalism in the destruction of the environments. But I think the two are linked. Yes. So, in fact, there's a very big challenge that we have now. which is of the same kind as the philosophers of the 18th century who had to, and the second half of the 17th, who had to devise new ways of assembling people. And this challenge ended up in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which coupled two things. One was the necessity of freedom, of emancipating the people, and the other one was the well-being. No, and these were two promises that were coupled. The problem is that one of them, well-being, became out of hand, in a sense that it was predicated on the idea that resources could be extracted from the earth and augment the amount of wealth that could be distributed. We know now that it is not possible. And in fact, the other major intellectual challenge, which was the one of the 19th century, which was how do we deal with inequality in the accomplishment of this dual promise, that is socialist thinkers, no, from Marx to Proudhon, was based on the same illusion. That is, that you could extract wealth from the earth and in order to fuel what we now call growth. We know now it's not possible. So we have a major challenge now, which is equivalent in a way to the challenge that the philosophers of the Enlightenment and the socialist thinkers of the 19th century faced, which is finding a way to conceptualize relationships between humans and non-humans that are not only not predicated on inequality, but which in a way suppose that it is not predicated on the infinite consumption of the resources of the earth. That is not based on the idea of growth.
Yes.
And this is, I mean, there are people thinking about this, and I can't talk tonight too long about this, but I think this is the challenge. And the challenge is an intellectual challenge, in fact, also, no? As it was an intellectual challenge for Montesquieu or for Marx.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think my issue with the concept of capitalism is that it's one of those concepts that, you know, will take many different forms depending on which period that you're talking about. I mean, which capitalism are we talking about? The capitalism that we have after the 1980s is very different, surely, than the capitalism we had in the 1960s or in the 1920s. So, of course, there are continuities, but I suppose that Katarina's question was, you know, whether it's possible to envision a real change in the way we relate to nature and to natural resources without getting rid of capitalism altogether, or whether it's possible to return to some kind of more benevolent form of capitalism through the influence of, say, you know, recent discussions around degrowth that you were talking about. So let's keep capitalism, but let's focus on degrowing, right? Let's promote degrowth, just as we are promoting growth now, following the industrialist model that, as you said, was common and shared by socialists and capitalists alike. I mean, Mao and Stalin were as committed to the destruction of natural resources as Donald Trump. You know, of course, in different ways. But is it possible? Is it possible to keep to keep, I mean, what is your view? Is it possible to keep capitalism but somehow return to some more benevolent form of capitalism committed to degrowth?
I don't think so. I think that capitalism, which defined in the very classical sense that Marx gave to it, which is there's a difference between people who own the means of production and people who don't. Although the possession of the means of production have taken different forms now, because it's not possessing plants or machines anymore, but the possibility of transformation in the mass media, in the entertainment industry, in the computer and global networks, etc., etc. But this idea that there is a dissociation between various, and it has augmented in a tremendous way. Thomas Piketty's book on capital is really impressive, since it's based on 150 years of series of and to see how inequalities have in fact progressed over the years, in spite of a betterment of the general level of life in certain parts of the world, means that this dissociation between the possession of capital and the people who in fact are entirely dependent of the choices that are made by those who possess the capital is very difficult to maintain. So what form will it take? I have no idea. This is, again, I think this is a collective endeavor that all those who are trying to think of new ways, of new cosmopolitics, participate in a way in this debate. I have no easy solution for that. But I don't think it will take the revolutionary form that it took
with socialism.
With socialism in Russia and China, etc. I think it will take different forms, which are yet to be understood. Some of them, as I said before, being the exemplarity of some experiments, like the one I mentioned in the zone à défendre in France. The exemplarity functions quite well. So there was an exemplarity, for instance, in the 19th century in the anarchist communes. No, they developed and they established themselves. They migrated also. So there were anarchist communes by people from Europe, in Brazil, in other parts of the world. They failed, but there is an exemplarity to forms of living which can be perhaps put to use in order to change the basic relationships between humans and non-humans.
One final question, because time is almost reaching the end. How are we going to convince the most powerful and those that are in a position to to command resources and to make decisions, to take responsibility for what has gone wrong, because clearly the responsibility is unequally distributed, as you show in your talk, and to protect the interests of those occupying the most vulnerable positions? What can we do in that respect?
I don't think that convincing is the right word. It's not a question of convincing people of changing. Also, there's some people might see the light and renounce to their privileges. I think it's a question of power relation, that if people do not mobilize en masse for this kind of action, nothing will happen. In the same way that, as we said before, the protests by the younger people in Europe are very efficient in many respects, because no one took them seriously at the beginning, and now they are beginning to be taken seriously. So I don't think it's a question of convincing anyone, but a question of trying to establish a power relation, which is, I mean, it's not nothing new, which enables different forms of political standing to become acceptable. So it will be probably conflictual, as most of the actions against pollution, against the global warming, have been in the past 30 or 40 years, no, and they were efficient in that respect.
Would you agree that anthropologists and social scientists in general have to be more engaged, perhaps even more activist, given the circumstances that we're facing and the planet is facing at the moment?
I think that some of them are. It very much depends on the political context locally. I see with let's say surprise that the controversies in great nations like the United States take very bizarre internal forms within the campuses, no? And people seem not to be able to address more general problems that affect the whole society and the whole world. So we have to be careful not to look gaze our navels, no, and go out of the university, go out of the campuses in order to be more efficient. And this is, but I think a number of social scientists are already doing that. I've just made a film precisely along these lines called Composing Worlds, which is in part based on the experience of the Notre-Dame-des-Landes zone à défendre in Western France, for instance. So I think, yes, we have the intellectual and even physical equipment for doing this kind of things.
Many thanks, Philippe. I think we have to put an end to this wonderful talk. I mean, many thanks for your opening the Pluralizing, the second season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene. It was a truly inspiring talk, and I'm sure that all the members of the audience also found the talk inspiring and very thought-provoking. Please join me in thanking Philippe, for this, for the pleasure of his company to begin with, and also for giving us some concrete and invaluable suggestions on how to get out of the mess in which we put ourselves, and try to find the way to survival. Really, it's really a matter of survival. Before you go, let me just remind you that the next session of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will take place on October 29th, and it's on November 5th, and we are going to have the pleasure of the company of an environmental historian, Rowan de Souza, who is going to give us a talk entitled "Hello Anthropocene, Goodbye Environmental History?" ? I'm very much looking forward to that talk as well. Rowan is based in Kyoto and has been working on the environmental history of India for several decades now. Thank you very much. Once again, the event is free, but registration is required. Please check the Seralv's website for more details on how to register. Many thanks once again for your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.